As one searches through the early history of the United States, it becomes clear that the use of indentured servants, and particularly slaves from the African continent, were the cause of numerous actions, decisions, laws, and countless acts of resistance during the formative years of the Republic. The use of slavery in the southern states to support and sustain the mainly agricultural economy of these states led to the creation of secret networks that assisted slaves in their quest for freedom. Rising tensions between supporters of slavery and committed abolitionists eventually led to a terrible civil war. These initial efforts by slaves to seek their freedom were mostly daring individual actions by slaves and those persons who secretly assisted them. These activities eventually evolved into a relatively well-organized operation with station masters, conductors, safe houses, churches, and many dedicated supporters. This operation became known as the Underground Railroad. It consisted of numerous routes through most current, northeastern, and midwestern states. Because we reside in the Rochester, New York metropolitan area, we're very interested in the history of its part of the network. What do you know about the Underground Railroad in the Rochester area? Who was its most well-known and prominent station master? What were the locations of his residences in the Rochester area? Do you know the locations of other prominent safe houses and their owners? How did the slaves move between safe houses in the Rochester area? How did the slaves and their numerous enablers secretly communicate among themselves in what was a decidedly hostile environment? What were the departure locations for slaves from this area of upstate New York to freedom in Canada? In this video, we will attempt to provide answers to some of these questions and tidbits of information that surely should be of interest to students of American history.
Children gonna trouble, God is gonna trouble it. God's gonna trouble the water. Waiting on the water. Waiting on the water, children. Waiting on the water. Everybody wait. God's gonna trouble. Everybody's waiting on water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
Man has always yearned for freedom. The Bible speaks of Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. They wanted to be free from the rule of Pharaoh. A Spanish seaman and colonizer named Pedro Menendez de Avila, infamously known as the Last Crusader, received an assiento or contract on March 30, 1565, from the King of Spain to conquer and later colonize Florida. Among numerous bequests and requirements, he was granted the privilege of transporting to Florida 500 Negro slaves. These slaves were taken from African slaves living in Spain, Portugal, and the Cape de Verde Islands of Guinea. 1/3 of the slaves were to be women. The stated purpose for requiring Menendez to bring slaves was to have them assist in the construction of 2 towns, the cultivation of land, the planting of sugarcane, and the manufacture of sugar. Their presence would relieve the 500 colonists of these severely labor-intensive duties. Although there is some dispute about the exact date, it is evident that during the first week of September 1565, Menendez and his fellow colonists actually founded the settlement of St. Augustine, Florida. African slaves helped to build this settlement and later cultivated the sugarcane fields. Some records also indicate that in 1581, the Spanish residents of St. Augustine, Florida, imported some additional enslaved Africans to the North American mainland. This is actually 34 years before the British arrived in Jamestown, Virginia via the James River in 1607. Their status was similar, if not equivalent, to that of white indentured servants, that is, people in temporary bondage. For the next two generations, white indentured servants were the principal labor force in British North America. The first documented Africans brought to British colonies arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 by ship. They were from the kingdom of Ndongo in Angola, West Africa. They had been captured during a war with the Portuguese. While these first Africans imported to British colonies may have been treated as indentured servants, the customary practice of owning Africans as slaves for life appeared to be readily accepted by the middle of the 17th century. The number of slaves increased significantly during the second half of the 17th century. They quickly replaced indentured servants as the primary source of labor. At this point of time, the Underground Railroad was not organized. Runaway slaves most likely relied on information they had heard about word of mouth to plan their routes of escape. They would go to a house or location they had heard about from others. Sometimes the consequences would be good, other times not so good. Keep in mind that because of the fear of being prosecuted because of laws punishing those assisting slaves, there is little or no written documentation of these early efforts. In researching sources for this presentation, we encountered Dr. David Anderson. He is a local historian and storyteller who frequently presents reenactments of events from the Civil War era. He and his colleagues also provide eloquent presentations in which famous persons such as Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and many others are portrayed in skits that highlight their efforts in the anti-slavery movement. These are extraordinary performances in which a specific date and event is recreated and which the notable is portrayed in an appropriate dress or costume and surroundings. In a brief video, he tells us about the travels of his ancestors who were slaves in the state of Alabama during the Civil War. Their experiences and the skills that they used to cross the Red River as they traveled to the state of Texas makes for interesting drama. The initiative exhibited by them in solving problems and the skills shown by them are some of the same ones that we expect that slaves used in their numerous efforts to escape bondage.
I believe so, and certainly stories that my father would pass on to me about his upbringing, who was in his extended family circle. Both his mother and father were people who had been born and came to maturity in slavery, and he was very fond of reminding me of who would have been his uncle, Uncle Reuben. Uncle Reuben appears in my prayers daily. Reuben was one of those people who did take his freedom roughly from a place in Limestone County, Alabama, along the Tennessee River. And supposedly his sister walked with him to the river, the Tennessee, early one morning before daylight. And they said their farewells, and he walked into the water. And I've invented the idea that to ease this serious accident that was going to take place, she intoned "wade in the water," because that's what he was doing, according to Daddy. And there were others, but that's the one that stands out most. There was an episode where one of the owners in these two family lines decided he wanted to have more territory to raise cotton, and so he took a whole gang of folks, including my ancestors, on a wagon train from Alabama to Texas. And apparently they had to cross, it might have been the Rio Grande River. No, it wasn't the Rio Grande, but anyway, cross a major river there. And one of the young male slaves, young male persons who were enslaved, ends up in the water, tugging and coaxing the horses to come on and keep pulling, even though sometimes their feet couldn't touch the bottom. So he too would escape, apparently. So those are the two instances I know of with some and feel secure about them happening.
The initiative exhibited by them in solving problems and the skills shown by them are some of the same ones that we expect that slaves used in their numerous efforts to escape bondage. The story of the Underground Railroad is an interesting epic of high drama, moral courage, religious inspiration, and unexpected personal transformation played out by a cast of extraordinary persons. These persons seem at the same time both startlingly modern and peculiarly archaic, combining then radical ideas about race and political action with traditional notices of personal honor and sacred duty. There are some key dates and laws plus other actions that are often included in most written records regarding the establishment of the Underground Railroad. Some of them will be provided for this presentation. These actions and dates are by no means meant to be inclusive of all of the significant events that are relevant. In 1641, the state of Massachusetts becomes the first British American colony to legalize slavery. This was indeed unfortunate because it signaled a significant change in the treatment of Africans and white indentured servants. An African servant, John Punch, and two white indentured servants were captured while trying to escape. The white servants were punished by extending the term of their indenture by 2 years, but John Punch was sentenced to serve in durante vita, that is, for the rest of his life. 1680, the state of Massachusetts, in an effort to deter the escape of slaves, prohibited the captain of any ship, ketch, or vessel from allowing blacks on board without a permit. In 1688, the Pennsylvania Quakers signed the Germantown Mennonite Resolution. This was and is still thought to be the first protest against slavery in the American colonies. Francis Daniel Pastorius and 3 other men wrote a petition based upon the Bible's golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and urged their Quaker meeting to abolish slavery. The petition argues that every human, regardless of belief, color, or ethnicity, has rights that should not be violated. They emphatically argued that in their society, the capture and sale of ordinary people as slaves, where husband, wife, and children are separated, would not be tolerated. In 1777, the first slavery emancipation begins. Vermont amends its constitution to ban slavery. Over the next 25 years, other northern states emancipated their slaves and banned the institution. Pennsylvania, 1780, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island, 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804. Some of these state laws stipulated gradual emancipation, but by the late 1820s, slavery no longer existed in the northern states. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. This territory later became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. This ordinance, together with state emancipation laws, created a free North. Also of considerable importance in 1787, the Free African Society is organized in Philadelphia by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. This led to the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This was the first African American religious denomination in the United States. This denomination would be a strong advocate in both words and deeds for the abolition of slavery before and during the Civil War. Even today, it maintains a strong presence in the civil rights struggles of African Americans. In 1786, Isaac Hopper of Philadelphia developed a program for the systematic assistance of slaves escaping the South. Within a few years, a number of anti-slavery operations spread in various directions in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The name Underground Railroad was coined shortly after 1831 when steam railroads were popular. 1804 was the year of incorporation for the Underground Railroad, or when it is thought to formally begin. In that year, General Thomas Bode purchased Stephen Smith and brought him home to Columbia, Pennsylvania. They were followed by Smith's mother, who escaped to find her son. The Bodes took her in, but within a few weeks, the owner of Smith's mother arrived and demanded her property. General Bode and his family refused, and the whole town supported them. Afterwards, the entire town resolved to champion the cause of fugitive slaves. In 1815, this same sentiment was expressed in Ohio, and by 1819, Underground Railroad methods were employed to get slaves out of North Carolina. In 1818, the Seminole Wars began in Florida as a result of fugitive slaves taking refuge with the Seminole Indians. As a response to the Fugitive Slave Act that was enacted in 1793, abolitionists used the Underground Railroad to assist slaves to escape to Ohio and Canada. In 1826, Levi Coffin leaves North Carolina, settles in Newburyport, Indiana, and begins his long career as a friend of the fugitive. He later moves to Cincinnati, Ohio in 1847 and becomes known as the president of the Underground Railroad. On September 30, 1830, the first convention of free people of color held a meeting at Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. This signaled the political maturity of free African Americans and without a doubt represents an early precursor of the American Civil Rights Movement. During January 1831, in Boston, Massachusetts, William Lloyd Garrison founds the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator. This event signaled a dramatic shift in the anti-slavery movement. In the previous decades, the anti-slavery movement was centered in the South and favored a combination of compensated emancipation and colonization. However, in the 1830s, the militant abolitionists began to demand an immediate end to slavery. They considered it a moral evil and felt no compensation was due to slave owners. In August of 1831, Nat Turner, a literate enslaved African American preacher, leads a slave revolt in Virginia. He and his followers killed 57 whites. As many as 200 enslaved African Americans were executed in reprisal. This widespread fear of slave revolt, compounded by the rise of militant abolitionism, leads legislatures across the South to increase the harshness of slavery. Their intent was to suppress all expressions of anti-slavery sentiment through state and private censorship and outright intimidation if necessary. During 1832, in response to the Nat Turner revolt, several slave states outlawed black preachers and exhorters and black religious services, except in the presence of certain discreet white men. During 1838, two significant events occurred. Black abolitionist Robert Purvis becomes chairman of the General Vigilante Committee of Philadelphia. This committee remained a prominent advocate for anti-slavery efforts in Philadelphia for many years. The second event that occurred in 1838 was the escape from slavery by Frederick Douglass as he escapes in Maryland. In 1843, Sojourner Truth leaves New York and begins her abolitionist pilgrimage. In addition, the Massachusetts and Vermont legislatures defied the Fugitive Slave Act by forbidding state officials from assisting in the recapture of fugitive slaves. During 1845, Frederick Douglass publishes Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It is an account of his slave experience and escape to freedom. In 1847, he also begins publishing the North Star newspaper in Rochester, New York. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escapes from bondage and travels to Pennsylvania. Tubman returned south repeatedly to help rescue several hundred others. During 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. This novel, dramatizing the horrors of slavery, sells 300,000 copies. Years later, President Abraham Lincoln, on meeting Stowe, would remark, "So you're the little lady who started this big war." During October 1869, John Brown, a radical white abolitionist and veteran of Bleeding Kansas, attempts to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, and initiate a slave rebellion. Brown and his co-conspirators are unsuccessful. Brown and other survivors were executed and became martyrs to the anti-slavery cause. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes the first Republican to win the United States presidency on a platform opposed not to slavery, but to the extension of slavery into the Western territories. In April 1861, the Civil War begins. On August 6th of that same year, the first Confiscation Act is passed and is actually a response to the first wave of escapees. That is, those acts of self-emancipation from Confederate territory during the Civil War. It defined African Americans who were captured or who reached Union lines on their own as contraband of war. 1862 was a memorable year for the anti-slavery cause. Numerous actions were taken that were significant to the movement. On April 16th, slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia. On July 17th, slavery was abolished in all U.S. territories. On July 17th, the Second Confiscation Act was passed by Congress. It freed slaves who reached Union Army lines. On September 22nd, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which declares all persons held as slaves with any state in rebellion against the United States shall be forever free. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln. It decreed that all enslaved African Americans in Confederate territory are free, but does not apply to enslaved African Americans in the Union slave states, that is, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and ultimately West Virginia.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
On June 28th of 1864, the Fugitive Slave Act is repealed. During October of that same year, the National African American Convention was held. It was chaired by Frederick Douglass. This convention pressed for voting and civil rights and strongly urged land redistribution be supported as essential to fulfilling the full promise of emancipation. During January 1865, land redistribution to freed African Americans begins. This was later reversed in the summer of 1865 by President Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson. On December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution is declared ratified. Slavery is forever outlawed.
At the beginning of this video, we asked the question, what do you know about the Underground Railroad in Rochester, New York and surrounding areas? Because we live in the Rochester metropolitan area, we are quite interested in the history of the Underground Railroad in the Rochester area. And right now, I want to give you a little tidbits of information about who was the most prominent station master in the Rochester, New York area. And that person would be Frederick Douglass. Along with Frederick Douglass, there was Amy and Isaac Post. In 1847, Frederick Douglass and his family moved to Rochester, New York from Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass wrote a letter to Amy and Isaac Post and asking him to find a location for him and his family to move to. And at this particular time, they moved to number 4 Alexander Street. As his family grew, he bought a house on South Avenue, and that's the location where number 12 school is today, on South Avenue. He lived there for 25 years, and he moved to Washington, D.C. We just want to give you a little tidbits of information about who were the most prominent people in the Rochester metropolitan area during this particular time.
In this initial presentation of our project about the Underground Railroad in Rochester, New York and the surrounding areas, we had 3 main objectives. First, we wanted to present some background information about the identity of those persons who first brought African slaves to the North American continent. Also, we wished to disclose their purpose for bringing them to North America and relevant information about the locations in which they arrived on the continent. Second, we sought to construct an appropriate timeline of significant events leading up to the formal establishment of the Underground Railroad. These were by no means inclusive of all of the events, but we also wanted to add significant dates and some descriptions of the events that were relevant before and after the railroad was established. Third, we wanted to provide the names of those persons intimately connected to these significant events and some information regarding their roles in the assistance of slaves in their quest for freedom.
Well, Ezekiel went down in the middle of the field, said he saw a mildew with a chariot wheel. Wasn't too particular about the chariot wheel, he just wanted to know how the chariot feel. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride. Rock me, Lord, coming easy. Home on the other side. Swing low, swing low, swing low, swing low, and let me ride. Well, Ezekiel went out and he got on board. Chariot went a-rocking right on down the road. Wasn't too particular about the rocky road. He just wanted to lay down his heavy load. Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride.
Swing down, chariot, stop and let me ride.
I want you to rock me, Lord.
Come and easy.
Hey.
I got a home on the other side.
I got a home on the other side. Got a home on the other side.
Got a home on the other side.
Got a home on the other side. Got a home on the other side. No more pain on the other side. There's no more sorrow on the other side. No more trouble on the other side.